Hello there, this is Sohail Hasni, your host at Energypreneurs. Cheap solar power, batteries, and electric vehicles are changing the transport and energy sector as we know. I bring in guests to this podcast who will help you with their ideas to navigate this energy transition. Thank you for joining. Good evening. Great to have you on the podcast.
Hi, Sam.
And you have done amazing long-range drive, among other things. Maybe introduce yourself first.
Sure. My name is Peter Kilby. In my day job, I work in a distribution network in Queensland as an engineer. And I've had 2 EVs since 2017 and a few electric bikes as well. So yeah, I've been enjoying and learning about the experience of living with an electric vehicle for a while. And yeah, I'm quite passionate about electrification more broadly, but particularly in transport. And since 2019, we've had a Model 3 and I've done quite a few road trips in that, but this has certainly been the longest one. And that's a little bit about me.
Wow. Maybe you can explain your longest could mean different thing to different people. Some people do 200.
So Australia is a very big continent. And my longest trip we've just recently done was around Queensland, rural Queensland. And it was 5,500 kilometers. And that was about 4 days of driving. But obviously that was spread over a month's time.
So 5,000 kilometer over 4 days drive.
No, we did it over a month.
Okay.
The total driving time for that 5,500 kilometers was almost 4 days.
Okay, 48
driving.
hours, 96 hours drive.
And so in that period, we mostly charged on the DC fast chargers. So there's been DC fast chargers up and down the coast of Queensland for quite a few years. I first did the trip from Brisbane to Cairns, which is about 1,700 kilometers in 2019. And in the last year, really, there's been DC fast chargers installed in Western and rural Queensland, more remote parts of Queensland. And until the last 6 months, people have had to rely on AC charging if they've gone into rural Queensland. And so I think the government funded deployment of DC fast chargers in Western Queensland in recent months. It really motivated me to start to plan a trip and explored sort of these more remote parts of Queensland in my electric vehicle.
In your drive, obviously you had access to the fast chargers. So you didn't feel that's anything separate than a gasoline car, right? Just another car, right?
No, not at all. I think that the contrast with driving a gasoline car is that there's not a petrol station in every town. And so there is something inherent in electric vehicles that promote range anxiety. It's that we're still very early in the uptake and deployment of this mode of transportation. And so at this stage, if you want to do these trips into the more remote areas, you do need to do some planning up front. But having done that plan and that preparation in advance of my trip, and also having done quite a few trips over the past few years, I was quite confident about my options and having contingencies in place if things went wrong, charges were down and things like that. And so really the biggest concern for me on this trip was getting a flat tire. We've had a Model 3 since 2019. It doesn't have a spare tire. And we were going in some quiet places, hundreds of kilometers from anywhere with maybe mobile reception and things like that. And so that was my biggest concern. We had a tire patch kit, but yeah, in terms of charging, I knew where the caravan parks were. I knew where the DC fast chargers were. And if they were down, I knew where alternative charging points were. I think the 2 key applications that I used for that sort of preparation and mitigating any range anxiety, or I guess charger anxiety, I think is probably a more relevant term. The car very clearly specifies how much range you've got. The Tesla is also very effective at predicting any sort of shortfalls or changes. It identifies if there's significant headwinds. It identifies if you've got a heavy foot and you're driving too aggressively. It identifies if the air conditioning is working too hard, mainly because of the heat. And so based on considering all those metrics, it's very accurate in terms of predicting your range and can give you plenty of warning about how to modify your driving if that's going to risk you not reaching the location. And so the only, I think, anxiety that EV owners do still face is this charger anxiety. Is the charge going to be working? And that certainly occurred in a few cases. We were passing one town called Gingin, and on checking the app called PlugShare, it showed that the 2 next chargers that we were planning on relying on at Miriam Vale and Mount Larkham were out of action. And so by doing that check an hour before we arrived there, we were able to take advantage of the charger at Gingin, top up a little bit longer there than we otherwise might have, and we're able to make it to the next working charger beyond Rockhampton. So yeah, I think range anxiety is a misnomer. it applies just as much to petrol cars as it does to electric cars. And the only difference really is about this charger or, I guess, fuel station anxiety that probably people in the 1920s and 30s, when fuel stations were still rolling out, might have faced and had to plan. But yeah, for electric vehicles, there's not. And people who are familiar with that technology, I don't think range anxiety is really a thing.
Exactly. I had a situation 2 weeks back. I was driving in rural Victoria from Lakes Entrance trying to come to Sydney, but we thought, okay, we'll stop at Eden. And we had a full charge, literally. And then suddenly the app routed us, say you cannot go through this 100-kilometer stretch. Instead, you have to go through 450 kilometers, and you will arrive there at 2% charge. So, of course, I did not look at that properly. Then I said, wow. And then there was a gentleman driving a big, large Mercedes SUV. And he was saying, oh, I think we'll go. I have no worries. Just my wife said we can't go alone because if in case there is a tire puncture, are you guys game? Then we'll go. And I told him, listen, it's really not the car. I don't think it's a wise decision to go in the middle of nowhere, national forest. Police stopped us because there is a fire going on. I don't think it makes sense. Then okay. Doesn't matter what car. Yeah. I think, let's stay. We had 20 minutes from a main city, Lakes Entrance. So we all waited. I think there were hundreds of cars over 3-4 hours. And then it opened up. And when we drove through, there's still burning on both sides for a few 100-meter stretch. So I think you are right that range anxiety, I personally think, is something that is created by the fossil fuel industry just to slow things down. But anxiety should come when you're trying to do 500 kilometer. But again, who wants to do 500 kilometer in a single day? You did 5,000, but you spread it over a month. It's a lifestyle drive.
Absolutely. Yeah, it was about seeing the site. And so in rural parts of Australia, there are many areas which do still have quite large gaps between charges. And so those challenges present there. I think over time, we see NRMA planning to roll out a national network of chargers. We see most of the states also deploying chargers now increasingly in rural areas. And so those gaps are going to get filled, and we're going to have chargers in every country town. The other challenge that often does present is the single charger site. So many of the rural sites, they have low utilization. So it's not really economically viable to put multiple chargers in those sites. But the problem there is that when one charger goes down, there is then no charger available. And that can cause delays when someone else is already using the charger or when it's faulty. So I think that this is still the early days. We know, and the charging deployers, charger point operators know how to fix these issues, and it's just going to take time and funding to address those sorts of challenges. The other thing that I guess is always of interest to people was the cost. We did stay at a few caravan parks in the gaps that were longer than the range of our vehicle. So the drive from Cairns to Hewenden, I think it was about 800 kilometers or something. There was no way I could make that. There was no public charges in between. So fortunately, there's many caravan parks in rural parts around Australia with all of the grey nomads, as they call them, driving around with their caravans. So we just booked a couple of nights stay in some caravan parks and some scenic areas we wanted to see. And overnight, we just charged much more slowly, obviously on AC at 15 amps. And that was the way we filled in where there were gaps. And so along with the small number of free charges that were offered complimentary with the accommodation we provided, we ended up spending $200 specifically for charging for that 5,500 kilometers. So yeah, $4 per 100 kilometers or something like that. I was chatting with one ute owner while we were at Carnarvon Gorge, and he was saying he spends $40 per 100 kilometers on his big ute. So yeah, the costs for fueling these vehicles are completely unmatched. And that's not the reason I got the vehicle, but it's a very attractive reason for people who are looking to reduce maybe their operating costs of driving and people who drive long distances. And that really, I think, opens up the potential for this electrification of transport in fleets and things like that as well. You can see the opportunity there.
My takeaway from 2 long drives, one I went to Sydney to Sunshine Coast in a single day. That was 1,000 kilometers. And that was my first long drive after I got.
Yeah, big drive in one day.
Yeah, Model Y. But then I realized that the planning is very important, knowing what it is. So have you been in a situation where you really had to go down saying, oh my God, I have to maybe knock somebody's door saying, can I get few kilometer charge? Did you drive yourself down that much?
I haven't done that so much myself, but yeah, I think I've got a few examples to talk to. But before I was going to say, I just had on the planning. I think there's no doubt Tesla do that better than anyone else. They've been in this game a long time now. And planning is quite complicated in Queensland outside of the southeast, because when you're a Tesla driver or any driver, because there are no superchargers outside the southeast. But if you're going from southeast Queensland to Sydney, or the Tesla app just makes it so easy. You don't need to plan it because of the way it plots those charging journeys along, stops along your trip. And so, yeah, I think we'll find more and more of the different EV manufacturers are implementing planning automation within their cars to take that stress off people. So I can understand not everyone wants to plan their EV journey like I do, but I think the vehicles will solve those problems in coming years. Your question about what's the worst case scenario, certainly on these long trips, we've never had to ask anyone for a charge. This is our second electric vehicle. Our first electric vehicle, which we still have, is a Mitsubishi i-MiEV. So that's a little sort of city car, has 4 seats. And when we got it, it had a range of about 120 kilometers. And after we about 70,000 kilometers on that car, the range had dropped from 120 kilometers down to 80 kilometers. So the degradation was quite significant in that small battery. And I don't think the degradation is nearly as much of a problem in the newer EVs. That vehicle doesn't have active cooling and has no liquid cooling. So the Queensland heat is quite difficult on it, and that causes aging. And in addition to that, such small batteries, there's a tendency to need to charge them to 100% quite regularly because the range is quite limited. Whereas with our Tesla, we've only actually charged that to 100% on 8 occasions, and probably 4 or 5 of them were on this trip because we had such long legs to do between charging stops. Because we're not frequently charging to that really high state of charge, and that's what causes a lot of the degradation. We haven't seen nearly as much degradation on our Tesla to date. I think I mentioned in the post, it's seen about 8% degradation in 70,000 kilometers. But yes, the i-MiEV had caused us some troubles. My partner, we use that i-MiEV quite heavily. It's shared among 3 or 4 adults. And on one occasion, my partner was about 2 kilometers from home and didn't quite make it. It did run out. It was down to that, less than 100 kilometer range. It had been used for a run into town and a few other runs on the day. And so it just ran out. And at the time, she didn't have the charger with her or anything. So she ended up calling RACQ, and we had RACQ on the car. And so they just brought out a tip truck and did bring it home. It was only, like I said, 2 or 3 kilometers from home. So I got home and then it went on the charge. So it was okay, but really was a motivation for us. Since then, we have actually upgraded the battery in that car. So I think it might be interesting to your listeners. We spent $13,000 to upgrade that battery. So the original capacity of that battery when it was new was 16 kilowatt hours. And so they took out that battery, and in the same size area within the car, they replaced that with, I think, a 30 kilowatt hour battery. And that cost $13,000. And so that car now goes well over 200 kilometers. It makes it a more practical car. We barely ever have to think about the range. Like I say, it's only used around town. That's one example of where things go wrong. I think it's more common for those sorts of things to happen in short range cars. In the long range car, we typically charge our Tesla maybe to 60 or 80%, mainly on solar if we can at home. And we just don't do those sorts of long trips. And when we are planning those long trips, we've got the plans in place for where the charges are. So I think on this trip, I might have once got down to 7%, which sounds like quite a low number, but in a car that has 400 or 500 kilometers range, that's still 35 kilometers. So it's very unusual to get into stressful situations.
Yeah, I went down to 2% and the battery was saying, don't do this, it damages battery, you should find a charger. We had no option. I had an appointment with someone. I said, okay, we keep going. And it worked out okay, but it was one of those moments saying, okay, if it stops, I have to knock on the neighbor saying, hey, I've got this long cable. Can I charge for an hour or so?
It's surprising that they talk about the bottom buffer on a lot of electric vehicles. There's some of the video bloggers on YouTube and things that like to test cars to the limits and run them down until they stop going anywhere. And it's surprising. Some of these do stop dead as soon as they hit 0%, but quite a few of them have 10 or 20 kilometers of range at that level as well. So it can be quite handy to know that there's a little bit of extra below 2%, but I would certainly, wouldn't want to go there too often. I think it's a bit stressful when you get down to it.
And also when I went back, finally, I found a charger. So one gentleman saying, you look worried. I said, yeah, I went down single digit, then 2%. He said, oh, don't worry, mine. It still does 30K. I did that. I went up to 0. Oh, okay. Good to know, but you don't want to go there. Now, earlier, I was talking with someone in Sydney, and then one of the messages that was coming that yes, the early adopters got into electric vehicle. Now, of course, late adopters, you have to still wait, but this middle, everyone will come in. They still asking simple questions like this range, how long do you charge, and blah, blah, blah. And all those informations are available publicly, right? But they're not taking that initiative.
Certainly before we bought the Tesla, we had another EV, so that was really valuable for us. But even before we bought the Tesla, we hired one for a weekend. And I think the opportunities to borrow a friend's EV for a weekend or to hire an EV for a weekend is a great way to start to get a feel for what it's like and how convenient it can be to have an EV. So yeah, I think it's really hard to do anything as effective as actually trying it. Taking it on a road, a weekend holiday trip or something like that, I think is really a good way to start to get a feel.
Okay. But I actually told this person that exactly what you said, that any of the companies you call and ask for a test drive, they will give you a car. But she was saying, no, but still to go to that level, to book a test drive, there need to be some interest. I think people are still shying away saying, I don't know, it's unknown.
For sure. I think not everyone really wants to have to deal with the dealership and they expect some sort of commitment if you're borrowing one of their cars. And that's why I say if you are at all interested and you think that maybe at some point in the future you might get an EV, that the best way is to pay for it, hire it, and have a nice weekend away, enjoying the silent, high sort of acceleration performance that we know an EV can deliver. And it's just a lovely way to drive. And yeah, I think once you've had a taste, it's hard to go back to the clunky gears of a petrol car.
So what do you tell, say, wannabe entrepreneurs who wants to come into that space? So what do you think? What's your message to them?
It's undoubtedly incredible growth opportunity. We're still in such an early phase of adoption. Like we talk about, I'm not sure, is it somewhere around 10% of new vehicle sales are approaching being electric in Australia, which is still quite low compared to many other countries overseas. But that's still probably 1% of the total fleet being electrified. So the vast majority of drivers still don't have an electric vehicle. So there's huge growth potential there. I guess what are the challenges that early adopters are having that entrepreneurs can address? I think we've got now some really good solutions for planning our trips. And one of the challenges that's not really well addressed is when there are people occupying chargers that have walked away and left them. So I think that's sometimes a bit of a frustration for EV owners. So that would be something interesting to address. I think there's also interesting questions around the performance of secondhand cars. Our first EV was secondhand. We didn't really know the quality and the condition of the battery, but all we based it on was that it had only done 6,000 Ks. So we felt comfortable with that. So I think it would be helpful to better understand what the performance of condition of batteries are and things like that. What other things do EV owners? I think probably there's a lot of challenges with people who don't have off-street parking as well. So we've got apartment dwellers, renters, and there are people like that who might like an EV and haven't got good options. So I think if entrepreneurs would like to develop good solutions for those sorts of EV owners, that would be really worthwhile as well. I'm not sure. Just a few off the top of my head.
Yeah, I think also I was thinking last week that there is an association of the supply side, the car manufacturers, and others. But there need to be somehow consumer association so that people can share information around with better credibility. Because if a supplier tells you always take that with a pinch of salt, right? Of course, they will try to sell their car, right? So I am a member of a few of the Facebook groups where you can see people coming in and say, hey, I walked into with my new Model Y, what do you think? So I think that would be interesting if somehow that could be that knowledge or that group can be a little bit more, I don't know what some grouping for what, somehow that knowledge could be shared quite easily because any threads you lose, right? If you joining late, nobody like a Quora or something like it's been summarized, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there are some really good online sort of sites that do a really good introductory material for customers and lots of FAQs and people that want to buy EVs. But yeah, it's not always easy for new people wanting to find out about EVs. And I'm always talking to new people who are curious and explaining how easy it is. But there's lots of misunderstandings and concerns and things like that. So I think it would be good to have better resources for those sorts of people to access.
What sort of resources you use? Of course, when you are a super early adopter, there's nothing.
Yeah, no, there's lots. There is lots. Since before I had an EV, I think Norway has insights for many different sectors that are interacting with the transport sector as it electrifies. So I certainly think there's plenty of people online that you can follow that know more than you. Yeah, I'm a pretty regular user of YouTube, and there's some great bloggers on there. There's some really good influencers on LinkedIn. We're both on LinkedIn, and so I think there's some really valuable insights there. So these days, social media has really opened up the potential number of sources. Maybe it's sometimes hard to know who to trust, but I think that there is good sources online for anyone who's interested to learn it. And I do think that some people really engage with EVs in that way, but they don't necessarily have to hire one. They don't necessarily need to drive one at the dealership. They can just really learn lots by following the right sources. And that can be a really good way to get into the topic, even if maybe you're not ready to buy one.
Yeah, that's actually a very good point. I got interested into EV. I think it was 2009. I was working for a development bank. The energy minister was with me when we were in Copenhagen. So they were taking people, this climate conference, so picking up free from the hotel, delivering there. And I think maybe I have one little car at the time, though I think the one that you have, right? And we got in, and this minister, he's a very tall gentleman, and he looked at it, he said, does it work? And this gentleman who was driving was a passionate EV person, right? University teacher or someone. He said, you want me to show? And he really took for a spin and he said, it works. And that had a huge impact on me personally, and also the minister when we coming back. And he was telling me, can we do a project in the Philippines? This technology looks good. And that inspired me. We ended up doing a large project for creating 3 electric wheelers for 100,000 conversion. So this sort of little penny drop moments actually helps in a big way. I hope this conversation we are having can make someone to decide as well.
Yeah, I think my first experience with an EV was probably back in 2012, and it was through a fleet. So our workplace had purchased some EV. And so that was really what sort of attracted me and got me interested. And I think that now even there's a huge opportunity. Workplaces electrify their fleets. That's an excellent way of exposing more people to EVs. Because I think most people in Australia probably still haven't even driven an EV. And so if there's fleets that they can get that exposure to early on, it's another good way of them experiencing the benefits of electrified transport.
Yeah, actually, that's a good idea because all states have huge government fleets, right? So if you keep half a dozen in the building saying, hey, whoever wants to borrow for the weekends or a few days, that can have enormous value.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Just getting that familiarity with those technologies. Yep.
And then, of course, the EV, the next step is solar charging and integrating everything.
That's a very important area. Yeah. We have a solar charger at home. We've had a solar system for a few years now. And it's certainly, as I said in the post, the most affordable way of charging a vehicle, without doubt. That behind the meter energy is not typically highly valued in Australia anymore. The feed-in tariffs have come down quite a lot. And so the more of that energy you can utilize behind the meter, the better. And yeah, it's much cheaper than charging off the grid. Often EV owners aren't at home in the day. Maybe they're out at work. And so that also highlights the potential for not just doing solar charging at people's homes, but also implementing solar charging at workplaces. I think we've got many workplaces with large rooftops and or parking areas, which could have solar put over those parking bays. And so if we can start to offer complimentary charging, that's another sort of good incentive to get EV owners coming into the office rather than working from home, maybe. Yeah, offer some complimentary free charging and soak up some of that solar that's increasingly abundant on our electricity system in the daytime.
So you have like a 6 to 10 kilowatt rooftop solar, and you have a battery as well?
No, we don't have a battery. I've been tempted to have a battery, but to be honest, our PV system is 10 kilowatts and we've got 2 EVs, like I said. So in winter, we don't have enough power to charge our EVs just because we've got a bit of shading. There's not as much daylight in winter. And so we still depend on the grid to charge part of our EV use in winter, but in summer there's excess. And I've struggled, battery costs are still quite high. And given I don't have that much excess solar to charge a battery with, I struggle to justify the cost of the battery. I'd be interested if the price was right, of course. But yeah, we haven't taken that step yet. just because really we manage to use up a lot of our solar with our electric vehicles and our hot water system that turns on in the day and our appliance use, which is typically in the daytime as well. We've shifted as much load as we can into the day to make the most of that.
And maybe a few years down the track, even Tesla might introduce V2G so that you have a big battery anyway. The car is there.
Absolutely. I'm very much in favor of using those batteries, those incredibly large batteries, in more ways. Like we are globally, we're battery constrained, right? We're not producing enough batteries to deliver all the needs we have for storage in transport and the power sector. If we can use those batteries in our vehicles more effectively for multiple purposes, the owners of those EVs can get more value out of those assets. And it means we don't have to build as many batteries and extract as many resources to deliver a sort of a renewable energy system so we can reach those goals quicker. So I think vehicle to grid is really important in that place. Tesla's been a bit of a slow one to that path, but it's sounding like they're coming in the next few years, which is really exciting. I've certainly made a commitment, but the next EV I buy will have vehicle to grid. I'm not sure. That might be a Tesla. Maybe it'll be something else if Tesla does offer that feature in the near future. I mean, we were obviously out camping while we were out in Western Queensland in many places, and I would love to have vehicle to load on my vehicle as well. I think it's just a really useful feature to be able to power an induction stove instead of my little alcohol-fired stove and boil some water quickly and things like that. So I think those sorts of features that we're now starting to see on some vehicles are really appealing to many different users. Another one, of course, would be work sites and things like that. Having vehicle to load would be really useful for recharging the tools. So I think, yeah, there's a lot of exciting potential there. Can't come sooner.
Because Tesla Powerwall 2 was 13.6 kilowatt hour and maximum was, I think, 5 kilowatt. The Powerwall 3 will get launched in Australia very soon. I'm waiting for that. But that's still the same 13 kilowatt hour, I think. It can go up to 10 kilowatt. But then you put side by side saying, I'm tossing whether I should put a 13 kilowatt hour battery or not when you have a 65 kilowatt hour battery sitting there sleeping every night.
Absolutely. And I think there's been some concerns about the impact on the EV batteries and things like that, but I think they're overstated. I watched a really interesting webinar by Dr. Jeff Dahn, who's certainly worked with Tesla and been a significant contributor to the development of batteries. Basically, what he identified and his research has shown is that the way we treat those batteries has a huge impact on the rate of degradation. So certainly if you're cycling those batteries from 0 to 100% day in, day out, those batteries will degrade rapidly. But if we can just cycle those batteries between 40 and 60%, at least for the vehicle to grid application, the additional degradation is, you can't see it on the line. It's insignificant relatively, just the normal aging of the battery as it gets older. And so we can really use these batteries, and what 40 to 60% is only 20% of a Tesla battery, but 20% of a 50 kilowatt hour battery is almost as big as the Powerwall. And so you can get just the same value without causing really any additional degradation on those batteries. So I do think we can leverage these EVs in a really exciting way. And it's really, I think sometimes people can get put off by the thought of vehicle to grid. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have to sell power to the grid or that the electricity company is going to take over and control it when they use their power or anything like that. They can just use it to supply their behind the meter uses after the sun sets and things like that. It can just as equally be vehicle to home for their own use or vehicle to grid if they see any value in it. Yeah, their choice.
I mean, logic is simple. You will come home and use appliances. And when you come home, you bring your car home if you're driving a car.
Yeah.
It's as simple.
Yeah, and unless you're for some reason driving hundreds of kilometers, there's going to be plenty of capacity to cover that small amount of use through the evening. And there's going to be plenty of time for it to recharge after you've gone to bed and finished using your appliances.
And the battery densities are coming up and things will change. What's your view on the current level of autonomous drive that you have? Did you take the extra package from Tesla or do you have the basic one?
I probably foolishly did. Once again, I'm one of those early adopters. I pay the early adopter tax and get to try all these things that never really are justified economically, but they're a lot of fun to try. Yes, yeah, I've had full self-driving for quite a few years. I still like to turn it on wherever I can. It knows to stop at traffic lights and it struggles a bit around the city streets and sometimes it performs well and sometimes it does silly things still. It feels to me like it still has a long way to go. I've been watching some of the videos coming out of the US because they're certainly pushing ahead a lot more quickly and developing the technology, it seems like, in North America. And hopefully it'll come to other markets soon, and we'll be able to try it here in Australia. I'd certainly to get that opportunity, given how much I've paid for it. But yeah, it seems like it's got a long way to go from my experience in Australia, but eagerly anticipating the release of more advances so we can see where it can go. I don't know enough really about the capability. It seems incredibly impressive what you can do with machine learning these days. We're seeing sort of large language models, which are completely different sort of application, doing some pretty amazing things now. So I would be hesitant to say, no, it's not going to happen, or it's still 10 years away or anything like that. I don't know enough about how these things move, but they do seem to be on a bit of an exponential curve. So you can get quite surprised quite quickly as things move up that curve, can't you?
Yeah, because I remember test driving a Model X some years back that had it. So parallel park, you just click and it just goes and park. So you have that already.
Yeah, I have that. I don't use the parking feature. You get into the position and it says, oh, we can park you. And then you ask it to do it. It just is a bit janky and takes a bit long. And you've got a car there waiting for you to get out of the way. And I can do it quicker if I did it myself. So it can do these things, but still certainly not performing at the level that the drivers around you would expect to do it. And so they just assume you're a very strange driver and wondering why you're taking so long. So I tend not to use it for parking. The main use is the use that everyone gets out of autopilot, which is on the highway. It's autopilot. The standard that comes with every Tesla is a fantastic feature. Certainly, I'm not surprised at all with the stats that Tesla provide to suggest that it improves safety. It identifies driver inattention reasonably well. And so I think it's a very useful feature. And it enabled, I think I would be much less confident doing those long sort of 1,000-kilometer drives and things with fatigue sets in, because of the amount of attention that's required to constantly maintain your position on the road and your speed and all those sorts of things. With it taking the lead on those sorts of things and you just supervising, I think that's a really worthwhile benefit. And it's not just a Tesla feature. That's just a driver assist feature that a growing number of cars feature. And I think it's great to see those things becoming more likely available. They're really beneficial.
And this assisted cruise control or whatever new name it has it, but that's also amazing that the car coming to and stop. I had a situation where the car stop. It started and it went back all the way to 110. So it's quite amazing.
It's an excellent thing.
And have you used the summon? You have the summon, right?
Yes, I have the summon. It's a fun party trick. I don't trust it enough to really use it the way it's meant to be used. I want to supervise where it's going. It's typically driving around other people's cars and things. And I obviously hate for it to drive into something. I use it as a party trick to impress my friends occasionally, but I haven't really used it for utility.
Because the reason I take a lot of interest on that, because Tony Seba, who I was connected, I think I'm connected on LinkedIn, he's a Stanford professor. You must know Tony. One of his views are that soon there will be a lot of empty car parks because we use our car a few minutes a day on an average. So if everybody's car drops you wherever it needs to be, and then it becomes a Uber or become a public transport, then of course you need much less car to meet all the driving needs. In that world,
yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think they talk about these hype curves. We're probably in the lull of disillusionment or whatever at this stage, but there's no doubt AI, the rate of advancement, eventually it'll solve autonomous driving. I would hesitate to know if that's 2 years or 20 years away, but at some point that will be solved and it'll just make sense to make better utilization of these assets. They're very expensive assets. They cost a lot of resources to produce. And so better utilization of them makes an awful lot of sense. I think eventually we'll get there. I wonder whether it'll be because people want their cars being used to generate income and while they're at work, or if it'll be fleets creating autonomous driving for their long distance trucking and things like that. I think there's probably easier and harder applications. I'm not sure where it'll happen, but I think that ultimately SEBA will be closer to the money than the skeptics. I just don't know when.
Yeah, this is very exciting. Okay, I have to check now. Should I buy that extra? Right.
It's always missed out before it's gone, right? Because Elon Musk likes to threaten us with price increases whenever the features come along, and then it might be too expensive for you to afford if you wait too long. So you better get in now. That's what he wants you to do.
Thanks for your time. Is there anything else I could have asked you?
Yeah, the one other item that I mentioned in my post that I think is quite exciting is electrifying rural areas. So we've got a lot of challenges in rural areas with electrification. Those are areas that haven't got the population density. And maybe we can learn lessons from how it's being done in developing countries as well. I don't know if you've got any thoughts on that, but there's sort of two options. We can continue to expand networks into those areas, or there's actually maybe a few options that we can continue to expand the networks, and building networks in low utilization, low density areas is very expensive because there's not a lot of use to justify that investment. We can go down the sort of completely separate batteries and solar systems, completely off-grid solutions. But I think that's also quite expensive because batteries don't have the same length, like they're not 40 or 50-year assets like networks are. And I'm not convinced that rural areas will be completely off-grid and battery and solar, or we can have some sort of combination of the both. And as someone who works in a network company, I think there is a potential for us to continue to utilize quite weak, limited networks and buffer them with batteries so that when there's peak demand, the batteries can complement, and when there's low demand, the batteries can continue to utilize those networks and increase the utilization. And then also complement them with more solar and distributed renewable energy resources to offset the loading on those relatively low capacity networks. So yeah, I spent some time out at large cattle stations and things where they have very limited supplies. And obviously I couldn't charge at 70 kilowatts or let alone 250 kilowatts like we can get at public chargers. But I was able to charge, and it was very easy to do because there was a grid there. I didn't have to worry about batteries going flat or generators having to turn on to supply that energy. I do still see a place for networks in rural areas. And I don't know if you've come across any rural areas.
Yeah, I have a crazy view on that one. The magic is all in batteries. As if you add batteries and autonomous together, so these rural areas, the maximum daily need may be 300-400 kilowatt hour, maybe even 1 megawatt hour, and 1 megawatt hour is a truck. So if you set up an autonomous system that you trust, smaller ones can be drone, they can fly. So they can basically, without human intervention, leave the station, go and get charged wherever large solar is. Another replacement comes in and just gets connected. And there is a small battery just for the transition time. So that we knew it's a flow through the cable, doesn't need to flow through the cable. It can be flowed through a package, like a data package in a bus or in a sort of vehicle, or even a drone. So like I had an idea, of course, I think it was a little considered as a crazy at the time because a drone was not developed. We're talking about a project in a very rural area in an Asian context, public lighting. And I was saying that, listen, we need to find the right guys. One option would be if I could get a drone with a large enough LED that lights, say, 10 hours, we can just have a centralized solar charger, charge the drones, check, press a button, they fly out and go and hang themselves in whatever light post. Rather than being a $20 million, very expensive project because we have to put all of those poles. It could be maybe just $500,000 and it's a fun project. People say drones cannot be that intelligent. Now you see drone making light shows, right? So I'm sure the new generations will start thinking very different.
I love the idea. I also heard something similar talked about with households going off grid and just using vehicle to grid to back up during sort of cloudy periods and things. Yeah, I wouldn't want to bet against your idea. That's for sure.
Because here, I mean, I had it here. I'm sure you have it here. We all have tiny battery pack. This was unthinkable that young women will carry in their pants a battery pack charging mobile. Right? Now, as the battery density improves, if you could carry 10 kilowatt hour just in a decent size of a brick and it was nicely shaped, you might have a lot of those lying around in the house. An average house, 10 kilowatt hour electricity is a lot of electricity, right? So I think as the energy density improves, things will dramatically change. I'm very skeptic about distribution business survival. Of course, transmission you will need. Distribution, I really worry whether we really need that much.
So what are you seeing in rural sort of areas? I think you're in the Philippines, you said. What is happening in terms of rural electrification? Is there a lot of investment there, or are people being left to their own devices and finding innovative solutions?
I think because of the regulatory framework, because of the incumbents who are sitting there with diesel, there's not much motivation to reduce the cost because sometimes your revenue is a margin to whatever the cost is. So why I want to reduce the cost if I have to pass it to the customers? And customers are not enabled. Only option they have to walk out and go off grid. But of course, they don't have the technological or financial ability to do this.
Right.
So I think there is a gap. huge gap and it's growing. Because that's a bit I don't understand. I posted on LinkedIn this morning, and I was thinking, like, to make hydrogen viable, solar needs to be 0.5 cents a kilowatt hour broadly, if hydrogen was to be $2.50 a kilogram or something. In that environment, okay, let's assume that it will be 0.5 cent. Why on earth people will pay on-grid electricity for 30 cents and Tesla supercharger for 70 cents? There is something wrong. Either these structures all has to be written off, stranded assets, because if you can generate at 0.5 cent, that's what the hydrogen guys need. That's what I tell. The view I have is, if electricity becomes that cheap, then we have a lot more things to worry about than putting a hydrogen in our car.
Yeah, absolutely. That sort of world of energy abundance, we haven't really contemplated the implications of yet.
Look what happened with the telephone companies. I used to
That's
call
right.
my mom $2.60, this telecom, right? $2.60, $3.60 a minute international call. Now we are talking overseas. Zero
That's right.
marginal cost. It's unbelievable.
Yeah. Very interesting. I'm enjoying watching it with you. Thank you very much for the opportunity today,
Thank you
Soya.
so much.
I hope I said something interesting for all of your listeners, and I'll keep listening onto your podcast as well.
Okay, let's keep in touch. Thank you, Peter. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Energypreneurs. To continue listening to this conversation, please visit us at Energypreneurs. Thank you. See you next time.